Hello, this is Scott with the Android Guys podcast, and I'm sitting here with Luke.
Hello.
What's going on, brah?
Not much. Just another trip down memory lane.
Yeah, this is
Android.
How many have we done now? This is 5 or 6?
5 or 6, yeah.
Yep. This is Gingerbread.
Yes.
Today we're going to talk about Android 2.3. Mm-hmm. And each time we get in our little time machine, we don't go back quite as far. Mm-hmm. But in these first couple of years or releases, we do have to go back quite a few times to the same year.
Right.
We're at December 6, 2010, so we're only 6-7 months since the last release.
And was kind of a trend from release, you know. It's not it was kind of interesting as we looked back to see that they were doing iterations multiple times a year. Now it feels like if a company does that, they're very proactive.
Yeah, or they're like, are they just rushing to get things out?
Right.
Or are they not baked in fully? Why the urgency?
Right. And I think it was the thing that we saw from Google. You know, there was the hints of like, why are they putting this out when it's not half done, or
Yeah.
you know, but their tendency has always been, release and iterate.
Yeah, for everything.
Yeah.
Like Google Docs is a perfect example.
Let's get it out.
Start with something, and we'll just improve it over time. As we lived through it, it felt like they were farther apart.
Yeah.
These releases.
Right.
And as I'm going through looking at a lot of the old content that we were publishing at the time, and there was a point in 2010 as I'm going through the articles, and one of the topics was like a quote of Andy Rubin, who said that ultimately Android releases will get to an annual update.
Right.
And that felt at the time like it was annual. Mm-hmm. At the same time, it felt like, man, I just got this update, and now there's something else.
Right.
You know, it was.
Well, we were in it. You know, it was. It's easy to look back now and look at a higher up view. Mm-hmm. The analogy is a 10,000-foot view, and say, oh yeah, it was a lot. It was fast. But when you're in it every day, looking at it, going, man, this came out and has this. When am I going to get this update for this other device? And, months feels way longer than really it is.
Yeah, and that's part of that skewed perspective for me, is knowing that something exists, waiting for the update to hit a device that I already own.
Right.
And, you're telling me that 1.6 is out. Now we're talking about 2.2. I'm still waiting on my 1.6.
Right.
I'm still waiting on my 2. And you're telling me that there's something coming out with 2.3 with other features. Like, that was a really tough thing at the time.
Yeah.
Especially for so many people who are like, enthusiasts and really plugged into the space, that they want it. They want the latest and greatest.
And there wasn't really any. I still struggle to know why that was back then. If I had to guess, looking back, it was just things were moving really quick.
Yep.
And there was a team doing all of it instead of maybe separate teams for separate things. And it was, we'll get these updates to these older devices as we can.
Right.
And there wasn't necessarily a dedicated, when this comes out, we need to make it usable on all devices.
And you have to look at it from the perspective of a hardware maker. Hey, we just started down this road of working on this with our device, and we just got it finished, and it works well, and we've tested it, and we're good to go. You guys are coming out with something else. You're killing us. And now, you can see, and did see at the time, a lot of phone makers had to come out with these roadmaps and tell people on Twitter and blog posts, if you own these devices, you can look for this update. And it was like, there was a lot of almost like some kind of weird accountability that people were holding them to. And that space was such an interesting thing at the time because it felt like we are all entitled to know, I dropped $200 on this thing. When am I getting these features?
Right.
Where today, if you think about it, you ask the average person, are you excited about Android 12? I don't know.
What does it do for me?
Yeah, the features have changed and slowed down a lot, but the Android is no longer such a niche thing where these people feel like it has to be, it's mine, I need it, and I want to, mold this device to me. But it's an everyman operating system.
It is,
and people don't really know what powers it. They just know Android.
Yeah.
They don't know versions. They don't care. They couldn't tell you what kind of processor, how much memory. None of that matters.
Right.
But back in 2010, that seemed to be all that mattered.
Right.
And that's what we're doing with this series of the podcast is we're taking a look at Android's releases, the major ones over time, and we're looking at the historical context of what went into the platform, what was being added, what didn't exist until a certain point, and then we'll also talk about maybe a device or two of that time.
Right.
And again, when you talk about the devices at that time and as we compare them now, it's such an easy thing to do is just look at the bullet points.
Right.
Because it's just specs.
Right.
It's an arms race. It's a who can put the biggest, the fastest, the highest resolution or whatever. Where when you think of today's stuff and you think of the phones that are being released, everything is about the experience.
Right.
And that's something that, Apple was doing at this time, 2010. Everything, their ads that they ran, anything that they promoted was about the experience. And as an Android user, it was, hey, we have that too, but we seemed to care more about the hardware, the benchmarks, the tests, and we have this much memory and this capability. We have a SD card. And
I think maybe because the reason we were all focused on the hard facts and the specs was because the experience was so different across the board. We couldn't focus on experience because it was a different experience depending on what phone you had.
Yeah.
But all of that to say, it's been an interesting look back so far.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. I enjoy doing this, and as each time I start with another version of Android and kind of piece together the notes for the show, it kind of takes me back like, oh man, I remember all of this so clearly. And it gets more and more clear, of course.
Right.
I mean, but we're only really, from the big scheme of things, we're about 2 years and some change, 2 years, 2 months after the first Android phone.
Yeah. And
so
this is iteration 5 of the OS.
Yeah. So quite a lot has changed.
Yeah.
So we're talking December 6, 2010, the official date that I have here. The format that we've gone with so far is, before we dive into the Android side of things, let's kind of take people back to what life was like in the U.S. or around the world as far as pop culture and some of the things that were happening at the time. Luke, what was going on at the movie theater in 2010?
So December of 2010, we saw Tangled, the Disney Tangled, the animated movie, which is very underrated. If you haven't seen it, it's a gem. It's pretty fun for an animated family movie. Love and Other Drugs was another movie making its rounds in the theater. And then the big one was Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 1. So this was the end of the era, Yeah. It was...
Was this one of the first movies or series to split the last story?
Yes. To see like a...
Because I know Twilight did that.
Oh, there's the theater's actually giving us a cliffhanger. Like you saw it in the name, Deathly Hallows Part 1. You go, oh, wow. okay.
You're not going to give me the conclusion yet.
And now we've seen that, the 2010, we're in, 2021 now.
Right.
We've seen that multiple times. But yeah, this might have been one of the first, I can't remember exactly, but I do feel like this was one of the first to actually, boldly say, yeah, this is just part of the story. The rest is coming.
Yeah. What was going on television?
So the last episode of Larry King Live. That's a big one.
He's a staple. He's one of those has been a part of your life, and then you realize how long it's been since he's not been a part of your life.
Right. And then to contrast that, Conan on TBS. Wow. So we had the whole debacle.
Yeah, we had talked about that in a previous episode.
Right.
It was his last episode.
And then this was the first he found a place, found a home on TBS. And now we know as of recording now he's off.
That's over.
He's done. So there was that. There was within weeks of this release was the debut of Storage Wars. Remember that show?
Oh my gosh!
On the History Channel. There was the debut of the Walking Dead series,
which now is coming to an end.
That's crazy to think. That started. It feels like one of those shows that's always been such a part of pop culture. It brought zombies to the forefront. Mm-hmm. Zombies were that like kind of niche monster kind of thing. It was before it was all low budget, and you had like Day of the Dead, Dawn of the Dead, Romero stuff, but this was like
Frank Darabont, man, the guy, the showrunner was. They took it very seriously. AMC and this is. Towards the end of Mad Men and Breaking Bad, and it's like, we're going to put some money into it.
Right.
Now, I can give you a full podcast on my feelings for the show.
Sure.
And how that has evolved over time.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that was on TV.
There's one more TV thing that happened.
Oh, yeah, I'm looking at it.
And you only maybe care if you're where we are in the U.S., we're in Ohio. And this was the first game of LeBron against the Cavs. After the decision.
Yeah, that's that as a fan,
right?
Living 45 minutes from Cleveland.
Yeah,
that's that was a first go around.
Yeah, and
then he left, and then to come back and play against them just felt so weird.
It was very, and I was a LeBron fan through all of it. Yeah. I'm a fan of LeBron.
Yeah.
Like, I'm obviously a Cavs fan. I love the Cavs. But LeBron is an incredible player, incredible person. And it was weird. I understood the decision. I understood why he did it. It still didn't feel good.
No.
And it was a very strange thing to watch is, him coming back against this team that, you were
supposed to be here for us forever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was, that was TV around that time. And then if we're going, the next thing we do is music. If we're going to music, there was, Fireworks by Katy Perry was on the Billboard. There was Raise Your Glass by Pink.
Man.
And Like a G6 Far East Movement.
So where are the Far East Movement now, or where is that group?
Farther east, maybe?
That was such a hot, weird thing.
Yeah.
For just a moment.
It's weird thinking back. And I bet this is not the last time we'll say this in going through this series. I feel like we're starting to see changes in other industries as we look back on just this Android timeline of this is where we started seeing just more blips, more like flash in the pan kind of hot single, and then nothing. Where we're
Yeah.
used to seeing on Billboard for the most part up until this time.
Like staples.
Yeah.
Things that were established.
These artists that had careers.
Yeah.
You know, or you could see, oh, this is the beginning of a career, and now we've seen them since then go on and on. But some of these were like, man, this was the song that everybody knew. Mm-hmm. Where are they now?
I was thinking about that today as I was going through my head of, the discussion and how things have changed and how we were in the cell phone industry, back in 2003, 2004, and ringtones were this huge thing.
Yeah.
And there was like a whole industry of creating ringtones and selling them for like $1 a piece. And then now we're at this point where things have shifted and evolved, and I was thinking there are so many songs that we're going to hear in 10 years or look back on and go, oh my God, you remember when that was on every TikTok,
right,
or every Instagram video, for like 4 months,
and then back now in 2010, the thought would be, oh, you remember when everybody has that as a ringtone?
Yeah, firework, everybody's phone ringing, or that you couldn't escape that song. And 2010, people were cutting up MP3s and putting them on their phone because now it's an app.
Now I feel like if I'm anywhere and I hear a phone ring, it's weird.
If I hear somebody's phone play a song, like something off the radio, I look at them like, really?
Yeah.
You couldn't find something on your phone?
I barely ever hear a ringtone anymore.
Yeah.
Like, I think, granted, just because everybody's just texting more,
sure.
You barely hear anybody take a call. You see people calling on the phone still.
Yep.
But but it seems like every time I see somebody answer a phone, it's just a buzz in their pocket.
Mm-hmm.
Feels like we've gotten into this. I don't need everybody to know I'm getting a call.
Yeah. That's an interesting evolution.
Right? Yeah.
You can't say when that started.
Yeah.
Or how that started, but yeah.
So yeah, that's a look at December of 2010, kind of getting your head in the mind space of, all right, this is the world we were living in.
So if you're old enough, if you're our age,
sure,
or thereabouts or older, you can kind of go back and go, oh yeah, I remember that.
Right.
So this is where Android 2.3 Gingerbread comes onto the scene and introduces some new features that they're building into the platform.
Yes.
Now, some of these we've seen kind of sprinkled along the way, but they were done by the phone makers, saying, hey, we did this. We added a fix, or we saw a problem, we created a solution for. So let's talk a little bit about some of the features. And again, if you've listened to these, there may have been features that you looked at or that were important to you along the way that we didn't discuss.
Sure.
These are kind of just bigger ones that we find, and some of these are pretty exhaustive lists.
Yeah.
So for us to try to trim those to down to like 6 that were the most important. In the first generations of Android, there were a lot of consumer-facing changes.
Yeah.
Where today becomes a little bit more about the APIs and the the back side of things.
Sure.
And again, that's one of those things where as things slow, you can't constantly iterate with all of these flashy, like, now my phone can do this.
Right. Yeah, there's not as much innovation anymore, as much as just quality of life improvement.
Right. What were some of the innovations that we saw?
I mean, things like the one that jumped out to me as I'm looking at this list is just because of where we are today is support for NFC.
Yep.
You
like
know.
tap to pay is everywhere.
Yeah.
Mobile Pay, Android Pay, Google Pay, Samsung Pay, all of whatever you call it, whatever version it's gone through. This was really kind of like that. Hey, this is a technology.
Right.
This, near field communication, you had to kind of tell people what it is. Like,
right.
This is being built into Android. Okay, what does that mean?
Yeah. And then we were starting to see, I mean, it just wasn't available everywhere either. Even though your phone had it, if you were, had a flagship device or a newer device that had this, that didn't mean you could use it either.
Yeah.
I remember, I think between me and you, or possibly me and Sean, there was a text going of, hey man, I just paid for McDonald's with my phone and it actually worked.
Yeah.
Like, oh really?
Yep.
Yeah, they have the terminal set now for NFC. Oh, that's cool.
Yeah. And Samsung would come out a while later and say that, on our particular devices, Samsung Pay, our solution, works in places that you've already been paying for things.
Right.
There's no additional things. Now
Right.
just use your phone, where it might be like, well, I don't know if it supports this Android one or the whatever, but NFC was, also used for, or is used for, sharing files between each other. Also being able to pair a device. So NFC, you would see that in some generations of headphones, where you would just tap, and that's what gets your device talking.
Yep.
Easier than trying to go into Bluetooth pairing mode.
We saw more apps with the capability of like bump to share contacts.
Yeah.
Things like that.
And we would see that later with Android, and another feature coming down the road that they actually kind of internally, or they branded that as something between Android devices.
Right.
So NFC is one that is definitely being used today, and it's definitely something that we just kind of assume
was always part of it.
It's there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So for a while, when you would talk about devices being announced and released, NFC was one of those things you would make sure to call out.
Right.
It has that chip or that capability to read those things.
Other things are where we're seeing larger displays. So for support for extra large displays, like 1280 by 800 displays.
Which, we're now moved beyond HD, the 720. Right. Now it's, 800,
Yeah.
That's a really high resolution.
Yeah.
And still at that point that I can say that people can discern the difference.
Sure.
We do get to a point right around here where after that, it's just kind of like, I'm just going to have to trust you.
Yeah.
I understand that the resolution's better. They're, jumping way ahead when you get into these super high resolutions. You start to see that for Google goggles and being able to do these VR and AR stuff. So this is, this opens the door to things that are about twice the resolution of what phones were the year before.
Right.
At the platform level. This isn't to say we were seeing our first phones with 1280 by 800, but this is something that says Android supports it.
Right.
By default.
Right. Next down that list is support for multiple cameras. So last episode we talked about some front-facing cameras on devices, and the age of the selfie was becoming more and more popular. So this was baked in to Android then for multiple devices, because before that it was carriers were having to figure out how to make that work with their hardware, or device makers, I mean. Other things, improved keyboard.
Yeah, these are some of the quality of life kind of things that the keyboard now gives you copy and paste capability.
Which is weird to think that it wasn't standard across the board.
It might have, it was in phones.
Yeah.
It was in the browser.
Yep.
But the ability to kind of like select and highlight, copy, and paste within the keyboard.
Yeah.
Instead of like within the system. Excuse that background noise there. That was an interesting thing for me. Was it felt like it just opened the door to so much, like, oh my gosh, this is so much better now.
Yeah. To
do this, and then suggestions with your keyboard that seem to get smarter and give you the ability to recommend things for you. It felt more like it got you and it was like unique and learning you.
Yeah.
And then one of the big ones was the voice input. You could bake that into keyboards. These are quality of life things. These are also things that today we don't think twice about.
Yeah.
But at a certain point, it had to be supported. Or introduced to say, okay, going forward, we have a solution that is built into Android.
Yeah. And there's just the other two real quick. were just more quality of life. A download manager, so you could see, what you had downloaded, or to pause downloads. Sometimes you would have, if you're I think we're still in the world of APKs, and had you could get programs and software from other things outside of the Play Store still.
Yep.
And so you could manage those downloads a little bit better, or see where that stuff was, versus
to be able to go in and say, I don't know where these go.
Right.
After I downloaded this PDF, I looked at it, but I got to keep going back to the website because I don't know where it is on my phone.
Or download again. Would you like to download again?
Yeah. So
now, no, I just would like to find it.
Yeah, I want to read it.
Yeah.
So this gave a centrally located place to kind of see those things, and you can go back to them.
Right.
And then if you needed to, kind of move them throughout your device.
Right. And then the last thing is just improved power management.
Yeah, this is one of those things where you start to see, maybe with each version of Android going forward, is that optimization.
Yes.
More efficient battery. More efficient ways of turning off things that you're not using.
Right.
Without really like shutting down multitasking.
Yeah.
But just ways of saying, hey, the processors that we're using are improved. The apps that we're using are, we're able to kind of work so that these things don't close on themselves.
Right.
Forced closing was still one of those things where at this point you could be in the middle of doing something, typing or playing a game, and it would just close.
Right.
And that's super frustrating. So
yeah.
Power management. And then also the ability to kind of set some things like, I want my phone to go to sleep at certain times, or set, apps that don't have to always be constantly syncing and refreshing.
Right.
You start to give the user more control over their device.
Yeah.
So for actual devices,
yeah.
the one that we have here in front of us at the time, this was an interesting one. There obviously at this point in Android's history, we see multiple devices rolling out per year from most of the manufacturers.
Right.
These aren't necessarily devices, we don't talk about the best of the time, or the one that really kind of like changed the game, but something that just kind of says, here's what was happening.
Yeah.
And we also started to see, we talked about in the past, as Google would introduce a new version of Android, now they're starting to introduce devices that say, hey, here's where we think the smartphone industry should be. Here's where we think Android as a platform and hardware, where we think users should be.
Right.
Maybe not so much as latest and greatest, but here's the new benchmark.
Yeah.
And for this one, it was the Nexus S. What was the S? What was special about the S?
Oh, that was Samsung.
Yeah, that was a thing, man. It felt really interesting to see the biggest handset maker, at least in Android, make a branded, or I don't even know what I want to call this, but make the device for or with Google.
Yeah. It was a very strange partnership, because we had seen just Samsung devices.
Yeah.
But this it wasn't like a Samsung Nexus, which is what you would assume it'd be called.
Right.
It was just the Nexus S.
Yeah. And that was an interesting thing, because, previously we saw Google opt to sell their own phones through their web store.
Right.
And they had done some unlocked things along the way. Unlocked phones were still, for another few years, one of those things that are just, if you don't know what they are, you kind of not sure if it's legal.
Yeah.
You don't know.
And they were still premium, because we still had subsidized handsets.
There was confusion around the idea of what does unlocked even mean. Yeah. And whether or not it was like, is that a jailbroken phone? Did I do something that avoids the warranty?
Right. Yeah.
How do I get my hands on one?
Where's the support come from if I have a problem?
Yeah. So Google has long championed that.
Yeah.
And that was something that the Nexus S was available as a retail device. They sold it for about $530, which seems to be the kind of the going rate so far for like the Nexus One and like their developer phone for the G1 or the Dream. This one was sold through Sprint.
Yes.
This was a really interesting thing.
Yeah.
They had given T-Mobile kind of the HTC and the Google love for the first generation or two. But then now we're moving into Sprint, who at the time was the third largest carrier.
Right. Well, we saw the Droid, which was the Verizon.
Right.
The Droid was the first CDMA.
Yeah.
And then Sprint was also CDMA. It wasn't GSM.
Well, there was the Hero. Sprint had the Hero.
Yeah,
but
there was the Hero.
To have Android supported CDMA.
Right.
But it was just a weird, like, why not go to AT&T?
Right.
What's going on there? Like, I don't know I don't know.
Yeah.
I can't even begin to kind of like scratch that, but this was one that you could get through Sprint for $200, which was, again, about what people expected to spend on a smartphone.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about the Nexus S in terms of features.
So it was a 4-inch display, 800 by 480, which was what we had seen before. It was nothing special, especially with seeing, Gingerbread. We just said supporting 1280 by 800. It was okay. We've seen this. It had 412 megabytes of RAM,
512
or 512, and then 16 gig storage.
Those seem to be a pretty decent step forward.
Yeah, not bad at all.
And that was one of the things that I liked about it, because it was like, okay, so here's where Samsung makes this phone interesting.
Right. And up until then, I think from Samsung, we had seen 8 gigs with expandable.
Yeah.
So this was 16 gigs. And then it had a 1 gigahertz Samsung processor, the Exynos. And it was cool. It was cool to see 1 gig from a carrier. It was like, oh, okay, this might start being a standard thing.
Yeah, there was the Snapdragon, was it S or a Snapdragon first generation, and it felt like for a long time we were at 528, 600 megahertz.
Yep.
The new generation is now we're at a gigahertz, and we expect from going forward, you can't say you're a flagship phone or you can't compete at the high end unless you have that 1 gigahertz at that time.
Right. It also had a 5 megapixel rear camera with a VGA front camera, so multi camera, which was supported, and the 5 megapixel was the higher end at that time.
Yep.
It was a nice camera. And then to pair with that, with all the phone could do, it had a 1500 milliamp per hour battery, which was really good for that.
Yeah, I mean that when you pair that with the improved power management, you kind of feel like you're winning twice.
Right.
Like, hey, there's a bigger battery, and it's improved power, so I should definitely be, in hindsight, we look back and think, man, it did improve things, but we still had to charge our phones multiple times a day. We were playing games and doing all these things that we could never do before.
Right.
So we're spending all this time on these devices.
Right. More and more.
Yep.
And then it had NFC support.
Yes.
Which was, another, that was where hey, I can do this stuff with my phone. This is the future of not having, everything is in my hand. I don't have to pull my wallet out for things.
Yeah.
That was the beginning of where we are now.
Yep. The last feature we have here too is something that I feel like was really cool.
That's why I saved it for the last, because it was.
But then if you go too far in this direction, it's a pain in your butt.
Exactly.
We're talking about the display,
yes.
The glass that protected the screen.
Yeah, it was a slightly contoured, curved display,
which looked very intentional, very kind of like this is a design choice.
Sleek. futuristic. It was like, oh,
it kind of curved.
That's kind of cool.
It added curves in different directions. And when you kind of look at the phone, it felt nice to have on your hand, in your hand, and kind of like swipe across. Yeah. And you go today where almost at a point where swung the pendulum back because these screens would wrap around too much and lead to kind of like unregistered swipes and touches or phantom things or holding it just in your hand feels like you're actually touching the display. But at the time, this was a first, and it was definitely something it was remarkable.
It was.
You would, let me see, look at that. That's really cool looking. Did you ever spend any time with the Nexus S?
I had a buddy that had one, and I remember it was that was the first thing that caught my eye. I was like, wow, it was like it
was like a smooth pebble.
Yeah, it reminded me of like a luxury car idea. I'm like, oh, this is different than everything else.
Yeah.
You look at the specs and you're like, okay, yeah, this is pretty standard. But when you see it, you're like, oh,
yeah, here, hold this thing. What do you think?
Like, oh, I like that.
This is cool. Yeah, it felt like they were, it's so easy at the time to just make a boring slab phone.
Yeah.
And this felt like an intentional step into a different direction of these can be premium.
Right.
These can look premium.
Right.
And the definition of premium materials has changed over the years, but this was a device that looked like, hey, I like where Samsung is going. I like where Android is going. I like the marriage between the two of these. It was for me. It was. I reviewed one for the site. I liked it. I didn't appreciate pairing it to Sprint.
Sure.
And I think that I don't know how things would have changed over the years had they gone with, strictly unlocked or through a different carrier. But I don't know. I was just at the time, and it could be completely based off of where I live and use the phones.
Right. Yeah.
Sprint just didn't work well for us.
Right. And I think maybe that was most of it because in our market, so Northeast Ohio area is has been always spotty for certain carriers depending on where you are.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's across the board. It doesn't matter what carrier it is. Everybody has their problems. And it's real easy, most of the tech news of that time was from people in major cities.
Yeah.
So it was really easy to say or to not have problems because there was coverage for every carrier.
Yeah. People in San Francisco or New York,
right?
It's going to be about the same as another carrier.
Doesn't matter.
So your headline is it's available here. It's through this carrier,
right?
And that was something that I don't know with at the time. Android is still kind of trying to build a brand.
Yep.
Still trying to get out from the difference between what's a Droid and what's an Android and that. So with this being offered through Sprint or unlocked, it obviously didn't sell like crazy, but it was one of those situations where if you wanted it, you had to spend $530 if you wanted to put it with T-Mobile or AT&T, and it was another case of a niche market. Android this isn't an everyman phone yet. This isn't, it's priced in line with everything else, but it just kind of flat in the big scheme of things. And that's kind of a trend that we'll see from the Nexus phones and even some of the Pixels is they're never top selling phones of the year, but they tend to have some kind of like interesting features about them.
Right.
Luke, I don't have anything else to add here for 2.3 Gingerbread. Do you?
No, it was a good release.
Yeah.
It did some really cool things as far as getting some standard things into Android as like, hey, this is going to be a part of Android now.
Yeah.
But yeah, for the most part, it was quality of life.
Yeah.
And they were good changes, and they were needed changes, needed additions. But
the last thing I would say is it did feel kind of iterative instead of like a big, man, finally.
Right.
It just kind of felt like maintenance release.
Sure.
But like, hey, I'm glad these are here.
Right.
Not just sprinkle these things out. Some of these features that were, introduced along the way could almost be like over-the-air updates now.
Sure.
So some of the stuff that we didn't cover, but the things that were baked in can now be kind of pushed out as part of like a monthly patch or things.
Right.
So it's going to do it for me.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Luke. We'll see you again next week when we talk about Android 3.0.
Honeycomb.
See you guys.
See ya.